Bitcoin provides 24/7 liquidity. So on a Sunday night in America time, while Japanese Monday morning, while they're blowing up, the safety option is that if you hold Bitcoin, you have 24/7 liquidity if you need it or want it, which you don't have with almost any other asset. The downside is in terms of price, it's not great for those that are still holding. It is good for those that like to buy dips. I generally don't view Bitcoin as being a risk-off asset in the way that that portfolio people would think about it, meaning the price normally goes up during crises, because it's still not well understood. It's still, it's just sometimes there's leverage in the space. One thing I point out is that there's like pro-liquidity crises, and then there's anti-liquidity crises. Most crises are anti-liquidity, which is to say that Bitcoin's biggest correlation, from what I found, is liquidity. And when a crisis breaks out, normally it's not good for liquidity. And so Bitcoin is going to be one of the first things sold, especially because it's like that phrase, you sell what you have to, not what you want to, especially if we're talking about a 24/7 market on a weekend. As long as Bitcoin has upward volatility, which you want it to have because you want it to get much larger, that's going to come with periods of downside volatility. And then as long as it has both upside and downside volatility in large amounts, people are going to often treat it like a risk asset until it kind of reaches some much larger, more distributed, steady state, or at least like kind of gold-like in size. An example of a pro-liquidity crisis was ironically the 2023 American regional bank crisis. So Bitcoin performed poorly in, say, late February and early March, because that's where actually liquidity was worsening under the surface. But when the crisis actually hit, Bitcoin did well. And that's because the market immediately realized, the Fed and Treasury are going to provide liquidity. Things broke, and they kind of knew that that's something they had to respond to, and they did. And so Bitcoin did quite well after some hours. It actually did quite well pretty quickly, because that was a pro-liquidity crisis. Things like the COVID crash, or things like this dislocation we just saw, these are generally anti-liquidity events. So we should not expect Bitcoin to do particularly well during them. It still serves its function of giving people 24/7 liquidity should they need it or want it. But I think it's more like, and I think Parker Lewis has said this, it's not a hedge, it's a solution, in the sense that this is an alternative system that's being built. And so I wouldn't think of Bitcoin in anything less than like 4-year increments, because it's a structural, as long as the thesis is correct, it's a structural growth story. But one that is likely to be sold during most, negative liquidity crises.
So you're buying for problems 4 years down the line.
Yeah, and you're buying a solution for, like, if money's broken, you buy the least broken money, buy the good money. You try to build systems. Like when people ask me, what do you think about this recent Bitcoin price drop? And like my answer is like, I hold keys in geographically separated areas. I invest in venture, with Ego Death Capital for, like decade-long, like intended timelines. That's the kind of the time frame I'm thinking of when it comes to Bitcoin. And I generally warn that in any sort of intermediate term sense, Bitcoin is highly correlated with liquidity, does not do well usually during bad liquidity environments. The last few years, as good as Bitcoin was in dollar terms, it was even better in yen terms. If you're a Japanese person holding Bitcoin, you're like a king or a queen relative to what most people around you are experiencing. If we get that other type of rotation, you could have a similar thing. So I'm quite bullish on Bitcoin. With, I guess, the shortest time frame I give is maybe 2 years. I'm saying, okay, I'm bullish on Bitcoin with a 2-year view. But more realistically, I look out several years and say, well, I think global liquidity is going to be higher years from now. I think Bitcoin is going to be higher. But I don't expect it to be a risk-off play in the price sense, unless a particular crisis happens to be one of the fairly uncommon pro-liquidity crises.